In this video we're going to talk about diffusion as a principle, which is really important in biology, and then use that to explain how oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged in the lungs. Obviously we need oxygen for respiration, it's one of the reactants, and carbon dioxide as a waste product needs to be excreted. Diffusion is all about moving particles from a high concentration through to a lower concentration. And in biology, the most important thing we have to remember is that that's going to be happening through a membrane. And the membrane can be described as being semi-permeable. What that means is that it allows certain particles through, things which are small enough, so examples might be things like oxygen or carbon dioxide, but larger molecules, so sugar molecules or proteins, are too big to pass through the membrane itself and have to be moved by different processes we'll talk about later on. So diffusion is all about going from a higher concentration to a lower concentration, and you can see in this this diagram that what we've got to start with, because we're moving through time here, is lots and lots of these blue particles on the outside of our cell. This is the outside, the extracellular, and this is inside. So we start with a high concentration on the outside and a low concentration on the inside. And what starts to happen is that some of these particles will just start to move through this membrane, moving from a high concentration down to a lower concentration. And over time, a number of these will pass through until eventually we end up with what we call an equilibrium. Okay, so the number of particles, or the concentration of particles outside the cell, is equal to the concentration inside, and then diffusion stops. Another way to think of it is that this is happening down a concentration gradient. So we've got a high concentration up here and we're moving down into a lower concentration. And one of the ways I like to kind of try and explain this is to think about the idea of a boulder that, imagine this is a nice little hill, and on that hill is sat a stone or a boulder, and what's going to happen is that it wants to move from a high position to a lower position, we should say, really, and it's going to move down that gradient, down the slope. Okay, so we can say it's down a gradient. Now, depending on how steep this gradient is, okay, will determine how quickly the particles move. So it could be that a much steeper slope, this boulder is going to move much faster. If we had a much sort of shallower slope, smaller difference between my high and my low concentrations, this would be happening much more slowly. And because this rock is moving with gravity, we can describe the movement as being passive. It requires no energy at all. Alright? So diffusion only requires the kinetic energy that these particles have. So, for example, if I was to raise the temperature here, if I was to put the temperature up, these particles would be moving much more quickly than they would be at a cooler temperature. And if you have a look at this diagram, what this is showing us is that inside and outside of a cell, it doesn't really matter which way round, particles are moving continually across this partially permeable membrane. You can see there's tiny little gaps that allow small molecules through, but not big molecules. And these particles will move randomly, really, until eventually the concentrations are the same, and then there's no what we call net movement. So some of these in this middle diagram, some of these orange ones are going to be moving from left to right, some of them might be moving from right to left, but most of them are always moving from the high concentration to the low concentration until those two concentrations are equal and you've got an equilibrium. So let's see how this works with gas exchange and carbon dioxide and oxygen needed for aerobic respiration, produced by aerobic respiration. So what we've got here is, again, just remember, high concentration, lower concentration, passive process, it's diffusion. through a partially permeable membrane. And what we can see here is this is called an alveolus, which is a little air sac in your lung. There's millions and millions of these, so you've got a very large surface area for this gas exchange to happen. The lining of this is only one cell thick, as is the lining of the capillary which surrounds it. So any gases only have to move through a layer of 2 cells. Alright, so it's very, very quick. Now the blood that's coming back from the body has a high concentration of carbon dioxide because it's moved from the respiring cells into the blood. And the air that we've breathed in has a very low concentration of carbon dioxide. So there's a gradient along which the carbon dioxide can pass from the blood here into the alveolar space. Now, in terms of oxygen, the air that we breathe in has a high concentration of oxygen, and the blood that passes through the lung is deoxygenated, has a lower concentration of oxygen because the oxygen has moved out from the blood into the respiring cells to be used as it passed through the body. So in both cases there is a nice gradient from high to low, depending on whether you're carbon dioxide and you want to move from the blood into the airspace, or you're oxygen and you want to move from the airspace into the blood. Now we can keep the concentration of carbon dioxide in the airspace very low and the concentration of oxygen, very high by breathing in and out, what we call ventilation. Every time we breathe in air that contains about 21% oxygen and very, very little, almost 0% carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide then diffuses out of the blood into the airspace and the oxygen diffuses into the blood. So the air that we breathe out has less oxygen in it, probably about 17 or 16%, and a much higher percentage of carbon dioxide, probably about 3 or 4%. And in that way we make sure that there's always gradients for oxygen and carbon dioxide to move along. This diagram just shows the same thing going on. You can see here what we've just looked at, oxygen being exchanged for carbon dioxide in the lungs. And down here you can see the reverse happening in the respiring cells. So if this was, for example, muscle cells down here, what's happening is the oxygen is moving into the cells where it gets used up in respiration, aerobic respiration, so there's always a low concentration of oxygen inside those cells. And at the same time the carbon dioxide that's being produced means there's a high concentration in these cells, and so it moves into the blood. And in that way, as the blood passes around the body, it picks up oxygen and excretes its carbon dioxide, goes back round into the respiring tissues where the oxygen is picked up by the cells. They deliver carbon dioxide by diffusion back into the blood, and the cycle repeats. In the same way, as the blood passes through the small intestine, glucose is able to be picked up by the blood because there was a high concentration of glucose inside the small intestine, very low concentration inside the blood. And as it comes round, that glucose moves out with the oxygen to be used in aerobic respiration, so the concentration inside these cells is going to be low, lowers the concentration inside that blood as it moves out, and so when it comes back through the small intestine, the cycle repeats.